my feet. Wanna drink my wine. Wanna move my feet. Wanna drink my wine. Wanna move my feet. Wanna drink my wine. Wanna move my feet.
Hey, what's going on, Reef Builders? It's Evan Montgomery coming at you from a new location this time. A couple months ago, I actually had to pack up my house, tear down my reef tank, and move across town, which, as you know, with a tank like this, is never a real fun process. You got to get in there with a hammer and chisel sometimes and really tear things down. So that's the downside, I suppose, to moving, is things never quite go back the same way. But on the upside, I got a bunch of more space. So I got a few tanks set up down here. And with that space, I also get to do something that I've been wanting to do for pretty much my entire career as a reef keeper, and that is upgrade from 2-part to a calcium reactor. As many of you probably know, keeping the alkalinity and calcium levels in a reef tank at the optimal levels is basically the most important thing you can do. Your corals will be pretty upset if you let that slip for very long. So not having to mix up 5-gallon buckets of 2-part every couple months and then refill dosing containers every 6 weeks or so, really gives you a peace of mind that you can kind of let things go for a little bit longer, and they'll probably be a bit more stable as well, depending on how everything is set up. So I got the DaStaCo C2 compact calcium reactor over here, and it does take up a bit of space. Let's see, I've got a Salifert test kit box right there for kind of a size comparison. So that's kind of what I was talking about, where I needed a little bit more space to set this up, as opposed to just sticking it under down by the sump or something like that. It's nice to have it have a little dedicated space for it over here, and for the CO2 tank up there as well. One thing you're probably noticing, if you're in the United States as I am, is these are in fact European plugs. So this entire thing and all the components run on 220 volts. So one of the first things you'll have to do if you are picking one of these up in the United States is to get some sort of voltage converter. That's what this box is down here. You can pick those up for well under $100 almost anywhere where electronics are sold, especially on the internet. I'm kind of out in a rural area, so I had to go to the internet for that one. But once you get that set up, that's pretty much the only unique thing that you have to do to really set this up that doesn't come out of the box if you're in the United States. If you're in Europe, you obviously don't have to worry about running 220 volt lines. That's what all your plugs are. So basically, this is what's called an automatic calcium reactor. There's a handful of automatic calcium reactors on the market. DaStaCo is one of the primary ones that people think of when they think of automatic calcium reactors, though. And basically what the difference is instead of having pH probes and bubble counters and all these little things you have to fiddle with and components that could possibly fail at some point down the road, all components can possibly fail down the road. Instead of using that, this utilizes a float switch, which is tied in via this little red wire right there into this power strip. Is actually a controller. It looks like a power strip, but it's actually the entire controller for the calcium reactor. So basically what happens is the CO2 inside this little chamber down here, that's where the CO2 is injected. Once the CO2 fully dissolves, the water level inside that chamber actually rises up a little bit, and it triggers a float switch. And that float switch, via the controller, turns on the solenoid and adds just a little bit more CO2. That little bit more CO2 drops the water level, therefore dropping the float switch, and the cycle repeats itself. You do occasionally, not 100% of the gas in there is CO2, unless you're buying some crazy expensive CO2 tank, but I just get that from a local brewing shop. So there is a little bit of inert gas in there that does not dissolve. So one of the two control knobs on the DaStaCo here, the left-hand one, controls how many times it does what they call venting per day. So most automatic calcium reactors do a venting to release that inert gas. And basically all that means is it shuts down the recirculating pump for a brief period, lets all that gas kind of bubble up to the surface, and then once the system comes back online, that gas is just pushed out in front of the effluent there. So in addition to controlling the CO2, how often that's added, it also controls this peristaltic dosing pump, which is the main drive of water through the chambers here. This pump is for recirculating within just this single chamber and the CO2 gassing chamber, and then the peristaltic pump actually sucks water from my sump and pushes it into that same CO2 gassing chamber down there, where it then circulates in here for a little while and then eventually makes its way back out, degassing as much of the CO2 as possible. And then I have it feeding straight out into my overflow box, nice and easy, just like that. That way I can take the lid off my tank, doesn't affect anything. And also by feeding into the overflow box, you degas a little bit more CO2. You know, give that water just a little bit more time to lose that gas before it contacts your livestock. And now you're probably wondering, since it has those European plugs and they don't make an American model or version of this thing, where you actually pick one of these up if you're in the United States. And that's Unique Corals. They're in California, and they are the distributor for these in the United States, as well as replacement parts. So if you need another 220 volt, one of those Eheim pumps, the recirculating pumps, they can help you out, get that type of stuff. They distribute it because they distribute a lot of things through what's known as the Triton method. And that's kind of the idea behind this, and especially the calcium reactor media that's in here. This is not your normal calcium reactor media, which typically is basically just dead corals. These are pretty much just little limestone chips, about an inch and a half across in some cases, some of them smaller, some of them bigger. And that is an extremely pure calcium reactor media. So one thing I am concerned with running this long term is that I will have to dose some trace elements. The two-part that I was using in the past included some trace elements, and every time I would do a test for, you know, like an ICP test, everything came back more or less in line. So I'm kind of curious. It's been almost 2 months. I might give it another month, wait a full 3 months or so. And then send in a water sample, because I'm not really dosing much as far as trace elements other than iodine, because that's just such an easy one to do a couple drops every day. So I am curious to get an ICP test back and see, but the reason that they recommend using these the larger limestone chips is because of the fact that it's an automatic calcium reactor. The pH is maintained a little bit lower than your typical calcium reactor. I want to say this is around 6. And a normal one might be around 6.7, 6.8. So I think the concern is that some of the less dense media that's actually coral skeletons could fully kind of dissolve and turn into a mush, which worst case scenario would just clog up all the tubing and stuff on there, I guess. So I'm sticking with this for now, and then if I do need to dose some extra trace elements, I'll do that on the side. But I really like the idea of keeping the calcium reactor for the calcium and alkalinity, and then all the other variables can be controlled separately. But I really like the concept behind the clean media on this. So something I was a little bit concerned of when I first set this up was it going to be able to keep my alkalinity, especially calcium usually doesn't bounce around as much, but was it going to be able to keep my alkalinity nice and level? I have an app on my phone where I enter every time I test, which is usually twice a week, but when I first set this up, it was more like twice a day for the first week or two. And, you know, you should see that graph just almost straight lined. The only reason that there was a little bit of bounce to it was the day and night cycle. You know, the corals uptake a lot less calcium at night. And one thing, DaStaCo thought of this. This actually is a component that I have not yet hooked up. Just because I wanted to keep things real simple to start with. But this is actually a light sensor, and one end of this plugs into the controller on the calcium reactor, and the other end of it goes, I guess, basically anywhere where it can see your lights over your tank. And then the theory behind that is when the lights are off at night, it will actually slow down and dose a little bit less. I don't think it completely stops dosing, but I think it just doses less, and then maybe a little bit more in the day. I'm not exactly sure. So that's something that I'm going to hook up at some point. I do want to experiment with that. And then once I do, I'm going to start my series of twice daily tests again and see if it really makes that graph just straight all the way across. The variation that I was seeing, though, was only about 0.3 DKH over a 24-hour period. So, you know, there's arguments that say even a slight variation in alkalinity like that over the course of a day or a week is actually good for corals, and keeping everything completely the same can be bad in that when things finally do inevitably change, your corals have been used to one thing for so long that they can't handle it. But either way, even without the light sensor, this thing keeps the alkalinity right where it needs to be. You know, you obviously still have to test your alkalinity all the time, or, you know, twice a week is probably, depending on your system, probably good enough. And then make slight adjustments to exactly how much effluent is coming out based on that. You know, like I said, I've had to turn mine up from, I started it at 1 and now it's all the way almost up to 3. And I expect by the time this tank is full of corals, it might even be up to 5 or 6. So that's something to keep an eye on. But the automatic calcium reactors make it really, really simple. It doesn't seem like it happens that often that a piece of gear comes around that I try out, like the DaStaCo reactor, that just works flawlessly. It's not over-engineered, it does exactly what it needs to do, and every component seems to work just perfectly. I really wish I had hooked up a DaStaCo reactor a lot sooner. You know, it seems so simple to pour in a little bit of 2-part once or twice a day or hook up a dosing pump, but you know, once you get one of these set up and watch it keep your alkalinity where it needs to be and watch the pumps for a few days, that is honestly, to me, as satisfying as pretty much anything else in the entire hobby. My corals definitely appreciate this as well. There's a few little sticks that I just glued down a few weeks ago that are already starting to encrust and growing out some new growth tips and all that good stuff. And that is all thanks to the DaStaCo calcium reactor I have hooked up. So until the next piece of gear that I get to tell you guys about, I'm Evan Montgomery. Subscribe to Reef Builders, hit that notification bell, comment down below, let me know what you think if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys on the next one. Later.